Okay, so have you ever really stopped to think about how a tiny little mushroom, a massive blue whale, and, well, you are all somehow related? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But for centuries, scientists have been working on a system almost like a giant library for all of life to answer that exact question. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain on how it all works.
I mean, the sheer variety of life out there is just staggering. We're talking millions upon millions of species, from tiny microbes that live in volcanic vents to eagles soaring miles above us. Honestly, without some kind of map, it's all just beautiful, wonderful chaos. So, where do scientists even start? How do you begin to draw that map?
Well, the answer is you build a system. And that library analogy, it's actually perfect. Think about it. You wouldn't just dump millions of books into a warehouse and call it a day. No way. You'd organize them, right? By genre, by author, so you can actually find things and see how different stories connect. Biology needs that exact same kind of organization. But before we can even start putting things on the shelves in our library of life, we have to agree on what a living thing even is. So scientists basically have a checklist. Is it made of cells? Check. Does it grow and reproduce? Yep. Does it respond to what's going on around it, use energy, and keep its internal environment stable? If it checks all those boxes, congratulations, it gets a spot in the library.
And this is why it's so important. This system isn't just about being tidy. It's the one tool that lets us step back and see the big picture. It lets us move from just a jumble of different creatures to a clear map that shows how all of life is connected.
So, what does this system for bringing order to chaos actually look like? Let's dive into the nuts and bolts of how scientists create these categories for all living things. The official name for this whole setup is taxonomy. And the most important word to remember here is hierarchy. You know those Russian nesting dolls, where there's a big one, and inside is a smaller one, and an even smaller one inside that? Taxonomy is just like that. It puts life into really big, broad groups, which then contains smaller, more specific groups, and so on and so on. And these nesting dolls have names. The absolute biggest doll is the kingdom. We're talking every single animal on Earth in one group. But from there, we start getting more and more specific. We go down to phylum, then class, order, and family. Each step you take down that ladder, the organisms in the group have more and more in common, until you finally hit the two most specific levels, genus and species. Now, those last two levels, genus and species, are really special. They team up to create what we call the binomial system. It's basically a unique two-part scientific name for every single organism. It's why we're Homo sapiens. You can think of it like a permanent, universal address for every form of life, so that a scientist in Brazil and a scientist in Japan know they're talking about the exact same creature. Okay, so we've got our library shelves set up and a naming system ready to go. But how do biologists actually decide which creature goes on which shelf? Well, that's where the real detective work comes in. It's all about decoding nature's blueprints. Right. This is the core of it all. What are the clues? If you discover a new bug in the rainforest, how do you decide which family it belongs to? What are you actually looking for to place an organism in its rightful spot?
The number one clue is an organism's structural features. We're talking about the physical traits you can actually see and measure. Does a bird have a long, thin beak for sipping nectar, or a short, powerful one for cracking seeds? Does an animal have fur or feathers or scales? These physical characteristics are the clues written right into the blueprints of life. The whole game is about comparison. Biologists basically become detectives looking for patterns. They're constantly asking what's similar here, what's different. They might notice that the bone structure inside a bat's wing looks incredibly similar to the bones in a human hand. These patterns are the raw data that builds this entire beautiful system. So let's make this a little more real. Let's look at a classic, super clear example, the huge divide in the animal kingdom between creatures that have backbones and those that don't. Yeah, right near the very top of the animal family tree, there is this massive split. And it's all based on one single major structural feature, whether an animal has a backbone, a spinal column, or not. So on one side, you've got the vertebrates. That's us. We have an internal skeleton with our spine right at the center of it all. But on the other side, you have the invertebrates, and that's this huge, diverse group that found other ways to support themselves, maybe with a hard outer shell, like an insect's exoskeleton, or with no skeleton at all, like a jellyfish just floating along. And just that one single difference creates two totally different worlds. The vertebrates are all the familiar ones: mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians. But get this, the invertebrate group is actually way, way bigger. It has everything from insects and spiders to worms, jellyfish, and starfish. It's a perfect example of how one key feature can draw a massive line in the sand.
All right, this brings us to the final and honestly the most important part of this whole story: the Great Family Tree. This is where we figure out what all this sorting and organizing is really about.
Because here's the big secret, the major takeaway. Taxonomy, it's not just about making neat little lists or putting things into boxes. It's about storytelling. It's a method for reading the epic history of life on Earth, a story that's written in the bodies of every living thing.
And here's the mind-blowing part. When you see those similar underlying structures, like that same basic bone pattern in a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, and a human hand, that is not a coincidence. Those are clues. They're telling us that all those creatures inherited that basic design from a common ancestor, way back in time. So this whole system of classification is really about mapping out one gigantic, incredible family history.
But at the same time, the differences are just as important. The reason a whale's flipper and a human hand are shaped differently is because they've adapted to do completely different things. One is for swimming, the other for grabbing. So those differences tell the story of how life spreads out, innovates, and finds new ways to survive in all kinds of environments. You know, a line from our source material really puts a nice bow on this. It says, "This system makes it easier to study biodiversity and, crucially, evolutionary relationships." It turns that beautiful chaos we talked about into a coherent story, a story about the deep evolutionary journey that life took to get where it is today. And that's really the grand prize at the end of all this. All this work, all this comparing and categorizing, what it does is reveal these hidden threads of connection that link every single living thing, from a fungus to a fern to a fish, into one giant, magnificent family tree. And this incredible system puts you, me, and every other living thing on a branch of that very same tree. Which kind of leaves us with one final big question to ponder. What does your branch of the tree look like? Thanks for tuning in.